Imagine waking up on a Tuesday morning, checking your bank account, and by the end of the month, a full fifth of your entire life savings has simply vanished into thin air.
Yeah, just gone.
Exactly. You didn't spend it, you weren't robbed, the money just vaporized. And that wasn't some hypothetical scenario for families in Iran in late 2025. That was really just a warm-up act for the potential collapse of a 40-year-old regime.
It was an absolute breaking point.
Welcome to today's deep dive. We are looking at a nation trapped at an incredibly volatile, existential crossroads following the unprecedented events of early 2026. The internal and external pressures boiling over right now are, well, they're fundamentally reshaping the Middle East.
They really are. I mean, the variables are shifting so rapidly that traditional forecasting models are just struggling to keep up. We are looking at the absolute definition of a geopolitical pressure cooker.
Right. And for you listening, trying to make sense of an overwhelming, chaotic daily news cycle, that is exactly why we're here. Today's deep dive is built on a massive stack of recently published geopolitical risk assessments and think tank reports.
Yeah, from institutions like the Council on Foreign Relations and the Quincy Institute.
Plus some really fascinating internal historical analyses. Our mission today is to cut through all the noise and focus on 4 specific potential political trajectories for Iran post-2026, ranging from stable democratization all the way to persistent authoritarianism.
And it's a wide spectrum.
It is. And because we are looking at intelligence reports and data from all sides of the political spectrum today, from pro-regime loyalists to exiled reformists, I want to be clear that our goal isn't to champion any one of these outcomes.
Right, we're not taking sides here.
Exactly. We're strictly looking at the structural math.
Yeah.
We want to impartially map out the raw data and the varying perspectives so you can see the architecture of what is actually coming.
So to map out those future trajectories, we really have to establish the baseline of why the country's existing trajectory suddenly fractured.
Where did it all break down?
Well, the catalyst was a simultaneous catastrophic collision of economic ruin and war in late 2025 and early 2026. Let's look at the mechanics of the economic failure first.
Okay, let's unpack that.
Iran experienced this hyperinflationary peak that structurally devastated the working class. We're talking about food inflation exceeding 70% annually.
I want to pause on that mechanism for a second because 70% food inflation doesn't just happen by accident.
No, it definitely doesn't.
When a state loses access to global banking systems through sanctions, it still has to pay its public sector workers. So the central bank starts aggressively printing domestic currency to cover those internal payrolls, right?
Exactly.
But because of the isolation, you can't import foreign goods to match that new money. So you suddenly have an enormous influx of freshly printed currency chasing the exact same limited amount of food on the shelves.
That is the precise mechanism. It completely severs the link between labor and survival. And because of that, the Iranian rial subsequently lost 20% of its value in just 20 days in December of 2025.
Wow, 20 days.
Yeah, and the final economic domino to fall was within the financial sector itself. A major institution, Bank Ayande, collapsed completely in December.
And in an isolated economy, banking relies heavily on fractional reserves and public trust.
Right. So when that single bank failed, it triggered a massive systemic contagion. A nationwide run on deposits just froze credit markets. Businesses could no longer make payroll. Merchants couldn't secure loans to buy inventory, and the entire commercial engine just stalled.
And when people cannot afford bread and their commercial lives are frozen, they invariably take to the streets.
Every single time.
The intelligence assessments note this sparked an unprecedented uprising. By early January 2026, 5 million people were protesting across 200 cities. And what really stands out when parsing this data is the demographic makeup.
Yeah, it was totally different from before.
Right, like past protests, the Green Movement in 2009 or the fuel protests in 2019, those were largely segmented by class or geography. This was different. Bazaar merchants, industrial workers, and Gen Z students were all uniting.
Uniting with a very specific goal.
Exactly. Their demand was not a plea for economic reform. It was a demand for the total overthrow of the clerical state.
And then, right at that peak of vulnerability, the external shock occurred. On February 28, 2026, the U.S. and Israel launched joint military strikes, designated Operation Epic Fury.
Epic Fury.
Yeah, and this operation resulted in the death of the supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei.
It's like a computer system getting hit by a massive internal malware attack that completely freezes its memory and operations, right at the exact moment someone violently unplugs the main server from the wall.
That is a perfect way to describe it.
The system has to instantly reboot into safe mode, stripping away all the user-friendly interfaces, all the background applications, just to keep the central processor running.
And that safe mode reboot is the immediate reflex of any entrenched power structure under existential threat. They patch the most critical vulnerabilities and project continuity to prevent a total system crash.
Which brings us to the first pass the intelligence community is tracking.
Right. Trajectory 1 is dynastic continuity, or basically a desperate attempt to maintain the status quo. On March 8, 2026, the Assembly of Experts convened. They voted unanimously to select Mojtaba Khamenei, the late Supreme Leader's son, to take his father's place.
Wait, I have to push back on the underlying logic of that move. The entire 1979 Islamic Revolution was fought explicitly to overthrow the Pahlavi monarchy.
Yeah, it was.
The foundational narrative of the state was the eradication of hereditary dynastic rule. So isn't installing the son of the supreme leader a massive, glaring ideological contradiction? Doesn't it essentially destroy the regime's own founding myth?
It shatters it completely.
Yeah.
But this move signals a definitive pivot. The regime has officially abandoned ideological purity in favor of raw physical survival. Mojtaba Khamenei is a notoriously shadowy figure who has never held public office.
Right.
He lacks the religious charisma and scholarly credentials of his father, having only achieved the clerical rank of Ayatollah in 2022 under highly managed circumstances.
So if he doesn't have the theological authority to compel obedience from the devout, his power has to be coming from institutional muscle.
It comes from deep, entrenched integration with the security apparatus. He has spent decades cultivating behind-the-scenes control over the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, and, crucially, the Beiti Rabari.
A supreme leader's bureaucratic office.
Exactly. That office is essentially a parallel government. It employs over 4,000 personnel and actively manages a network of 40,000 monitoring agents embedded across every single government ministry, university, and media outlet in the country.
Wow, 40,000 agents.
Yeah. And Mojtaba controls this sprawling intelligence apparatus. He was the safest, most predictable bet for the security forces to maintain their grip on power during the crisis.
But here's where the architecture of this starts to look highly unstable. If the religious legitimacy is gone, and this new supreme leader relies entirely on the military's muscle to enforce his rule, he is effectively a captive of his own security forces.
He becomes a puppet, essentially.
Right. And that leads directly into the second highly probable trajectory analysts are watching, the military security dictatorship. Think tanks frequently refer to this as the Pakistan model.
Yeah, the Pakistan model. In this framework, the formal civilian institutions, the presidency, the parliament, the judiciary, and even the supreme leader himself, they remain formally intact on paper.
Okay.
But they are completely subordinated to an elite military junta run by the IRGC. The military becomes the ultimate arbiter of all domestic and foreign policy, operating entirely from the shadows.
Let's look at a vivid example from the sources of how this mechanism actually plays out in real time. Masoud Pezeshkian is technically the reformist president of Iran. He won a popular vote.
Right.
In early 2026, unauthorized drone strikes were launched against Arab Gulf states. President Pezeshkian attempted to utilize his diplomatic channels to officially apologize to those nations and de-escalate.
And how did that go?
Well, IRGC General Ahmad Vahidi publicly reprimanded his own president and simply ordered the military attacks to resume.
Because the civilian government possessed absolutely no leverage to stop the military. And we witnessed the exact same dynamic internally.
Oh, with the internet blackout.
Yes. On May 25, President Pezeshkian issued an executive order to end the nationwide internet blackout that had been crippling the commercial sector since January.
Right.
But the Supreme National Security Council, which is heavily dominated by IRGC commanders, simply ignored the president's order and maintained the blackout.
It functions exactly like a hostile corporate takeover. It's like the original CEO is left sitting at their desk in the glass office for public relations, absorbing all the public anger and taking the heat.
While someone else runs the show.
Exactly. The head of security is secretly down in the basement, signing all the checks, managing the payroll, and making all the actual operational decisions.
The military runs the entire enterprise while hiding behind the original corporate branding.
But logically, if the military has all the guns, controls the wealth, and is making every single decision anyway, why keep the CEO around at all?
That's the big question.
Why wouldn't the IRGC just launch an overt, formalized military coup and be done with the clerical facade entirely?
It all comes down to maintaining a baseline of popular support. Even in its current severely weakened state, the regime relies on a loyalist base of roughly 20 to 40% of the population.
Okay.
These are people deeply committed to the civilian clerical system of the Islamic Republic. An overt, naked military coup risks alienating those true believers and turning them against the armed forces.
Ah, I see.
So by operating entirely behind the civilian facade, the IRGC maintains a vital veneer of constitutional legitimacy. They keep the loyalists sedated while holding all the actual levers of state power.
But that model only works as long as the head of security in the basement has enough cash to pay his guards. What happens if the money simply runs out?
If the shadow corporation goes bankrupt, the entire structure collapses.
Exactly, which opens up the third trajectory in the intelligence stack: state fragmentation and civil war.
And this scenario is driven by a hidden systemic vulnerability in Iran's economy that most people completely overlook.
Right.
When we think of Iran, the immediate association is massive, endless oil wealth, but the operational reality is far more precarious. Their aging energy sector actually relies heavily on imported gasoline.
Let's break down the technical mechanics of that because it sounds incredibly counterintuitive. A major OPEC nation that exports millions of barrels of crude oil has to import refined gasoline.
Yeah, they require that imported gasoline for a process called gas injection. Iran's primary oil fields are decades old at this point.
Okay.
To extract crude oil from these aging subterranean reservoirs, engineers have to pump immense amounts of pressurized gas or fluids into the wells to force the crude oil to the surface.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and without injecting that imported gasoline, the reservoir pressure drops below critical thresholds and extraction physically stops.
So if there is a sustained naval blockade, or if retaliatory strikes halt those specific gasoline imports, the entire domestic oil production sector isn't just slowed down, it is paralyzed within a matter of days.
Within a single week. And without that continuous oil revenue, the central government becomes fundamentally insolvent.
Because they literally run out of money.
Exactly. They cannot pay public sector salaries. They cannot fund the massive food subsidy programs keeping the population fed. And most crucially, they cannot pay local security forces.
And we've seen this mechanism play out repeatedly in modern history. When a central government cannot issue paychecks to its security forces, the chain of command dissolves.
It evaporates overnight.
Unpaid local police, border guards, and rank-and-file IRGC members abandon their posts. They either go home to protect their families, or they align with whoever can pay them locally.
Economic insolvency acts as an incredibly rapid, corrosive agent on national unity. When Tehran cannot project power or distribute wealth to the provinces, a massive power vacuum opens up.
Right.
Local warlords, tribal councils, and regional ethnic militias immediately step in to fill that void. They scramble to secure resources and seize massive weapon caches abandoned by the state, which, in Iran's case, includes highly advanced ballistic missiles.
And the analysts specifically map out regional ethnic militias, like Kurdish factions in the northwest or Balos groups in the southeast, seizing total control of their territories.
Yeah, and there are real-time early warning signs of this fragmentation happening now. Intelligence tracks Kurdish political factions already holding strategic meetings in Erbil, Iraq.
Basically coordinating future moves.
Exactly, alongside reports of escalating armed clashes at remote border posts. It's the scenario neighboring countries dread most, a localized civil war fought with advanced heavy weaponry.
It would represent a catastrophic failure of the state, radiating profound instability, refugees, and arms proliferation across the entire Middle East.
Absolutely.
But if the military state fractures and the regions devolve into warlordism, that leaves a massive, chaotic power vacuum in Tehran. And that is exactly where the secular reformist factions see their window. Which leads us to the fourth path: secular democratization.
Right. And this trajectory envisions the total bottom-up dismantling of the clerical security apparatus. The ideological core of the recent protests wasn't just a grievance about the economy.
No, not at all.
It was a profound, direct rejection of the regime's Islamist globalism. The street demands are explicitly focused on establishing a secular, constitutional democracy and codifying gender equality.
And there is a highly specific mechanical blueprint for this outcome circulating in the think tank data. Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi, the son of the deposed Shah who was overthrown in 1979, published a framework called the Iran Prosperity Project.
The IPP.
Yeah, it's essentially an operational manual for managing a transition of power. It outlines a 100 to 180-day window led by a newly formed National Uprising Council.
The mechanics of that 100-day plan are really focused on institutional continuity. The goal is to formally dissolve the Islamic Republic's constitution while keeping the utility grid running, the water flowing, and basic services functioning.
Right.
And during this window, international observers would be brought in to monitor a national referendum, allowing the population to legally choose a new, secular governing structure.
It is a highly structured, optimistic plan, but I want to pose a critical question to you, the listener, because it's the glaring variable when you read through these assessments.
That was a massive hurdle in the room.
Yeah. Is this democratization path actually realistic? Or is it a diasporic pipe dream drafted by people who haven't lived in the country for 40 years? Like, how does an unarmed civilian population mechanically overcome an entrenched, deeply paranoid military force of over 1 million troops?
That's exactly it.
These are commanders who know they have absolutely no place and likely no legal immunity in a democratic future.
That is the defining structural obstacle. And the intelligence assessments point out massive hurdles to this trajectory. First, there is zero organized, armed opposition operating inside the country. The regime has spent 4 decades systematically identifying and crushing any nascent civil society or opposition leadership. Second, as demonstrated during the January uprisings, the regime possesses a consistent, brutal willingness to deploy lethal force.
To kill thousands of its own citizens just to maintain control.
Exactly. And third, even among fierce critics of the regime, there is deep hesitation regarding Pahlavi's specific plan. Critics argue that his transitional framework concentrates far too much emergency executive power in his own hands,
creating a severe risk of simply replacing a clerical autocracy with a newly branded monarchical autocracy.
Exactly the fear.
So we have mapped out 4 distinct, highly volatile architectures today. A desperate attempt at dynastic continuity, a shadow military dictatorship, rapid state fragmentation into civil war, or a turbulent transition towards secular democratization.
4 very different worlds.
If you are listening to this and trying to figure out which of these futures is actually materializing, how do you track it? Like, if the military's Achilles heel in that shadow dictatorship is cash flow, I imagine they are desperately trying to find new non-oil revenue streams to survive.
Oh, they absolutely are. And that provides us with specific, verifiable signposts.
Okay.
These are real-world indicators identified by risk analysts that tell us exactly which faction is winning the internal power struggle.
Let's go through them.
So, signpost number 1 involves the Strait of Hormuz. Recently, Iranian authorities floated the idea of reframing transit fees through this vital global waterway as protection fees or environmental maritime fees.
Wow. Okay. So if we see them successfully imposing and collecting these tolls on global shipping companies, it means the military is securing independent funding.
Exactly.
They're finding a way to survive international sanctions without relying on the vulnerable oil sector.
Which proves the military dictatorship trajectory is solidifying its economic base. Let's look at signpost number 2. It revolves around the digital infrastructure. As we mentioned, President Pezeshkian previously ordered the nationwide internet blackout to be lifted, and the military simply overruled him.
Right.
Well, if that internet blackout is suddenly lifted, it's a massive indicator. It would signal that the civilian reformists are actually clawing back executive power from the IRGC.
And mechanically, an open internet leans the country heavily toward the democratization trajectory because it allows fragmented civil society groups to finally communicate, organize, and coordinate nationwide action.
Yes. Conversely, if the digital grid stays dark, the military remains entirely in charge.
What about the third signpost?
Signpost number 3 involves tracking the state's most critical leveraged nuclear material. There are current draft proposals suggesting Iran might transfer its highly enriched uranium, its HEU stockpile, to China.
Wait, really?
Yeah. In exchange, Beijing would provide hard security guarantees and economic lifelines.
That is a stunning calculation. I mean, if the IRGC actually agrees to pack up their enriched uranium and ship it to China, they are actively trading away their ultimate geopolitical leverage.
Yep.
It shows they are pivoting purely to self-preservation. They're willing to sacrifice decades of nuclear ambition just to secure a foreign security umbrella that keeps them physically alive and in power domestically.
Exactly. It reveals that the ideological pride of a domestic nuclear program is entirely subordinate to the immediate survival of the military junta.
So to bring all of this together and wrap up today's deep dive, What the data maps out is a nation violently trapped between two massive, irreconcilable forces. On one side, you have the immense, undeniable democratic aspirations of a highly educated, rapidly secularizing youth population demanding integration with the global community.
The huge force.
And on the other, you have the brutal, mechanical reality of an entrenched, highly militarized state apparatus that is literally fighting for its physical survival.
And, the outcome of this structural collision will not remain contained within Iran's borders. The winning trajectory will dictate the stability of global energy markets for the next decade.
Right.
It will determine the expansion or collapse of proxy warfare networks across the entire Middle East, and it will fundamentally alter the geopolitical balance of power between the East and the West in the 21st century.
It's an architectural shift for the entire region.
Truly.
I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over today. Something that extends beyond the military tactics, the oil mechanisms, and the intelligence estimates. Consider the deep psychological toll on the society living inside this pressure cooker.
Yeah, it's immense.
What happens to the psyche of a nation when a highly connected, educated, and secularized population is forced to exist under a technologically adaptive, digitally repressive military state?
It's a terrifying question.
Can algorithmic surveillance and technological authoritarianism truly put a permanent lid on human aspirations? Or does suppressing that immense societal pressure just guarantee a much larger, much more devastating explosion down the road? When the system is forced into safe mode for too long, well, eventually the hardware itself begins to fail. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive, and remember to keep questioning the headlines.